Cuba sí. Cuba sí.
Every month, the Seattle Cuba Friendship Committee meets up and protests. They demonstrate against the United States embargo on Cuba, which has blocked trade between the two countries for nearly 60 years.
They talk about the failure of socialism, but where is the success of capitalism?
With anti-government protests planned on the island for November 15th, Cuba will once again enter the spotlight. Whenever that happens, right-wing Cuban Americans gain a lot of attention. But plenty of Cuban Americans, especially younger ones, are critical of capitalism. And they have varying opinions on the Cuban government and the US's history of involvement on the island.
Both of my grandparents on my mom's side and then my grandfather on my dad's side were all born in Havana, Cuba, and all left within 2 years of Fidel taking power and moved to Miami.
My dad's side of the family is from Cuba. They left the year after the revolution.
My parents are Cuban. They immigrated in 1968. As a socialist Cuban American, you stand in complete opposite. In the United States, you stand in complete opposite to your family.
For me, my views are completely different. I consider myself a leftist Marxist.
Growing up in a Cuban household, I mean, communism, the Castros, kind of boogeymen. The evolution of my views is due a lot to the decoupling of communism as an ideology and authoritarianism.
My family has espoused the classic narrative of like Democrats are communists and socialists and any form of governmental assistance is the form of communism.
I started asking questions like in a critical way once I was in the military, right? I saw what I was doing and then I came across Marxism. Basic things like public transportation, public education, housing for all, like different things like that, and then I was like, this isn't that bad.
Thousands took to the streets in the capital Havana and other cities across the country.
There are growing questions over whether Cuba's mass anti-government protests can survive a crackdown by the country's communist regime.
When the biggest anti-government protests there in decades erupted on July 11th.
When I heard about it, I was very happy.
The US media has portrayed it as like it is this huge, vast movement on the island and that people's rights are being trampled on. But if we juxtapose that with our own country, you know, how many people are dying in the streets by the hands of the police? How many people have died just last year in the United States because of COVID-19?
I felt very confused as a result of the coverage. Like, I feel as though there are two very polar narratives that were being given to me when the protests were happening, one of which blamed the embargo on the entirety of Cuba's situation, and another one which blamed the Cuban government for the entirety of the situation.
There's only one way that we can get through, end the cruel 61-year blockade.
The embargo is the single greatest propaganda tool that we have just given the Cuban government. If politicians in the US were serious about caring for Cuba and caring for the Cuban people, they would lift the embargo now. Yes, you would be putting some money into the government's pockets, but you know who else you would also be putting money into? The actual Cuban people.
The 180 countries voted to end the blockade.
Protests against the unavailability of food and electricity. It's really difficult for me to decouple those issues from the harm that we have caused through the embargo.
I think there very much is an answer where it's both the fault of the embargo to some extent and the fault of the Cuban government to some extent. Castro, as a leader, I do not agree with. I do not agree with what he's done, mostly, honestly, from the perspective of like freedom of press and speech.
We need to support a pro-democracy movement in Cuba. And then if the people vote for a communist government, that's fine.
And I think there's a pretty easy way to conceive how capitalism put Cuba in the situation it's in now in a way that like I don't think a lot of people appreciate. You know, Cuba was a colonized island and the legacy of colonization because of capitalism, I think is very evident in the way that the people still continue to suffer on the island today.
I don't think that it has to be a contradiction at all, that you can say capitalism is not a sustainable economic system. And then on the other hand, be like, well, yeah, the Castro regime, you know, did use violence, did use political imprisonment.
There is a trend towards younger people just being more open-minded, if anything else, to the concept of like critiquing capitalism. The wealthiest, like most conservative circles in Miami, like those big families and stuff, I think there's going to need to be some sort of like larger paradigm shift for a lot of people to like get around to that.